are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. Today is September 15th, 2024, and this is episode 295 of Lighthearted. This episode is a walk down memory lane for me, and I'll get to that in a moment. First, I want to thank everyone who attended our recent 40th anniversary virtual telethon. A big thanks to everyone who donated, and to all the people and organizations who provided videos for the event. And congratulations to Encore Dance Academy and the Cape Canaveral Lighthouse Foundation, the winners of our 2024 Lighthouse Dance-Off. And thanks again to all who entered the dance contest. Back in the late summer of 1988, I made a trip up the Maine coast with my wife Charlotte. It was my first time visiting many of the lighthouses in Maine. We lived in Winthrop, Massachusetts at the time, and I was in the middle of producing a series of video documentaries about Edward Rowe Snow, a popular maritime historian who is from Winthrop. We talked about the legacy of Edward Rowe Snow in the interviews I conducted on that trip, but we talked about lots of other things too. My wife and I drove all the way to Lubec, the easternmost town on the United States mainland. We visited West Quoddy Head Lighthouse, and I interviewed Maurice Babcock Jr. at his home. His father, Maurice Babcock Sr., was the last civilian keeper of Boston Light and Boston Harbor, and he was a keeper at other New England lighthouses before his 15 years of Boston Light. On the same trip, I interviewed Larry Baum at Fort Point Light on the Penobscot River in Stockton Springs, Maine. The light was being automated, and Larry was the final keeper there. I also interviewed Malcolm Rouse, who was the last Coast Guard keeper at Owl's Head Light in Midcoast, Maine, before its automation. The interview with Maurice Babcock Jr. was originally shot on VHS video. Years later, I transferred it to audio. I kind of rearranged parts of it for the segment you're about to hear. First, you will hear Maurice talking about revisiting Boston Light years after he had left there.
I asked my wife how she'd like to live out on a place like that. No way. She couldn't understand it. And I was explaining to her what a lot of room, big island, lots of fun out there. But it shrunk when I went back in 1961, which had been 20 years since I'd left. And it was under Coast Guard then. Man is always drawn to where he was brought up. I don't care how old you get, you always want to go back to where you were brought up at. Like my father was born on Campobello Island. And when he retired in 1941 from the lighthouse service, he only spent a year or so up in the Boston area, and he hightailed it down for Lubec. Yeah. And he always wanted to live on Campobello Island. So he was drawn to his boyhood on there. And he left there when he was 16 years old. Well, of course, Boston Harbor being the pearl of all harbors, I've traveled all over the world, and I've never seen any as beautiful, different, but not like Boston Harbor with all the islands.
I asked what the requirements were to be a lighthouse keeper in the old lighthouse service.
There was a written civil service examination, of course, when my father went in. Particularly on offshore stations, you had to know how to be a boatman and handle a pair of oars and know your way around on the water. However, the criteria after they got in the service was quite rigid. The discipline within the lighthouse service, it wasn't a uniformed discipline, it wasn't a salute type of discipline, but if a man was found drunk on a station, he was summarily dismissed. Bingo, just like that. If he deserted his station in time of danger, he would be dismissed.
Maurice talked about his early days growing up at Boston Light.
We felt sorry for those children that had to live on the beach and couldn't get out there. That's about the only thing I can say, because we had nothing to compare it with since I had never been brought up. Well, my time was half and half. We boarded ashore in the winter months, except for holidays to go to school. We stayed over there. We boarded with an elderly lady in a boarding house. The whole family did. So we got the touch of life on land with electric lights and flush toilets and stuff like that, bathtubs. But we still loved to get back out to the island. We just liked it, that's all.
You used to go to Great Brewster Island to play ball?
Oh, yeah. That was the bigger island across there. We had baseball games out there. In the water was out. There were a lot of kids on the other islands during the summer. Summer people used to lease land and build cottages. And then there's quite a few children on Boston Light. And during the summer months, we all played together as one big gang. We had rowing races and baseball games and bonfires, and it was just one day after another. So many things to do, but there wasn't enough time to do them in. Oh, every once in a while, I'd go out and try to catch a codfish or a flounder, but it wasn't a daily thing. It was so common that we never thought it was a sport. As a youngster, probably about 14 years old, I did a little lobster fishing. Never made any money at it. It was always a case of not having bait to fish for the lobsters. But I caught a few, and I used to sell them on Saturdays or Sundays. Good days, I'd row around the fishermen that come down from Boston that were with party fishing boats, and I'd take them out there and sell them for 25 cents. Start out at 50 cents and come down 25 cents a piece regardless of the size. And I'd probably have 10. I'd make $2.50 up to $5 on a Saturday or a Sunday out there. But I played more than I fished. My last summer on the island was 1940, and I joined the service in the spring of 1941 and was home for a few days in the summer of 1941.
One of the things Morris Babcock Sr. was known for was something that happened at the Cape Ann Light Station on Thatcher Island in Massachusetts near the beginning of his career.
That was on Cape Ann Light, Thatcher's Island Light off of Cape Ann, Massachusetts. And my father was the third assistant keeper. That was the first station that he was ever assigned to. And as the story goes, he was on watch in the fog signal on a foggy day, and President Wilson had been abroad to a Geneva convention, and he was sailing back on a cruiser with a couple of destroyer escorts. And between the horn blowing on Thatcher's Island, my dad heard these ship's horns off to sea, and they kept getting closer. And he was concerned that there were some ships out there that didn't know where they were, because they shouldn't have been heading into, they should have been getting fainter. He should have got louder and then fainter as they passed, but they were getting louder and louder. And he undoubtedly realized, as I have heard the story, he realized that they didn't know what horn they were listening to, or didn't hear it, one or the other. So he took it off automatic clockwork that blew the horn on a certain characteristic, and pulled the cord manually to give him a sound that he just kept blowing the horn, beep, 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 to make them notice that something had happened. And he relates that out of the fog, he saw the turning ships. And if it hadn't, he didn't say this, but other people have, if it hadn't been for that he had heard them, and that he was aware that they were off course, or something was wrong, and in his excitement he had to do something, just like pushing on the horn of your car horn, to get attention. And if it hadn't been for that, he suspects that they would have run, other people suspect they would have run aground on Thatcher's Island with, I don't imagine he saved his life, but he saved the Navy quite an embarrassment with the president aboard. I'm assuming that was one of the reasons for his rapid rise from third assistant keeper on Cape Ann to head keeper of a station in a period of about 18 months. And he went to Cape Ann, then as third assistant. Then he was transferred to Gay Head off of on Martha's Vineyard. And I don't recall just how long he stayed there, because that was before I was born. And then he went to Bird Island, right off of Marion, Massachusetts, in Buzzards Bay. And that was he was keeper of that station for 7 years. He went there in 1919. So it was about 18 months to 2 years from third assistant keeper to keeper, which was unheard of, I think. He went to Boston Light in 1926, and his first years on the station were kind of hectic because he was a strict disciplinarian, and things hadn't been in the past too well on the lighthouse. He enjoyed his 15 years on that station, but he was glad to leave also when he retired.
Yeah, must have really.
He devoted his many years, 25 years, I guess, he devoted to the lighthouse service.
By the way, aboard that ship that almost went aground at Thatcher Island in the fog that day in 1919 was not only President Wilson, but also the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a young man by the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt, along with his wife, Eleanor. Morris talked more about the duties of a lighthouse keeper.
They had a man on watch on the station. They stood 4-hour watches, 8 hours off, day and night, 365 days a year. And if one man went on vacation, they were 6 on and 6 off. They were always on the lookout for fog. They were always on the lookout to make sure the light was burning properly. And the old lighthouses weren't electric light bulbs where you could throw a switch. And they had what they call smoke-ups. It wasn't just switching a light. It was going up there and cleaning the lens in the middle of the night and getting the light back on as quick as possible. Mm-hmm. And it's something they didn't want to happen, so they watched it real closely.
A frequent visitor to Boston Light from the 1930s through the 1970s was the popular New England maritime historian Edward Rowe Snow. Snow was the author of dozens of books and appeared often on local radio and later TV. He was also known as the Flying Santa, who would deliver Christmas presents to lighthouse keepers and their families for more than 40 holiday seasons.
But during the 30s, early 30s, they were quite a sight, seeing the two of them paddling down the harbor, usually good weather. I can always remember Mr. Snow putting on a demonstration of his ability to stabilize the canoe. He'd stand on the gunwales, 1 foot on each side of the canoe, and his wife would paddle, just as a little demonstration for us kids there. Needless to say, Mr. Snow, when we were young kids, we were more interested in our play than we were in the antics of Mr. Snow. We didn't realize at the time what he was doing. He was a person, he and his wife would come there. We didn't realize till later years that he was researching for his books and taking pictures. We just couldn't understand why he was so interested in our playground, because it was so common to us. We didn't know the history of them, or they were just islands. And you reminded me on a previous discussion about the time they were caught in a squall down through there. The wind come up, and I guess they were taking on water. May have even capsized, I'm not sure. And my father, seeing them, went out and brought them ashore to the island and dried them out. If my recollections are correct, by the time they were, I don't think the wind subsided, so they stayed overnight on the island with us. When he got through with his canoe, he started tours down to the island. They used to leave from Rose Wharf, I think, and there was a cruise boat, double-decker, and quite often during the summer, Mr. Snow, at least once every couple of weeks, it seems like, Mr. Snow would come down with some passengers, historical society people, and Mrs. Snow, or Mr. Snow's mother, was often with them. And while the rest of the sightseers were looking around the island and going in the tower, and the keepers explaining the light and the fog signal, his mother would gather us on the front steps or some rock on the island, and she would tell us stories about sailing with her father down in the South Pacific and around Cape Horn and the storms. And she had a musical instrument. I think they called it a zither. And we endured her playing of the zither, but we really enjoyed her stories. And she would tell us, I think this zither that she had dated back to 1700 sometime. It was supposed to be an old instrument. Now, the people that come down from the city, they were amazed and quite concerned with all us children. They didn't realize that we went to public schools during the winter time. They were often concerned as to whether we were well fed. One of them asked my mother one time, she says, well, where do you get your fresh vegetables? These children look so healthy. And my mother answered back, why, we raised them. And they looked at the island, and it was mostly rock, couldn't see any gardens. And you raise them, where do you raise them? She says, right up out of the side of the boat. So it was a joke with some of the mothers and the keepers on there with the visitors that come down. They were concerned with our education and on our eating properly. I guess they figured we ate fish and crabs. I don't know.
Did anybody ever try bringing soil out to the island?
Not on Boston Light, no.
Mm-hmm.
I understand one of the islands offshore here in Maine, Matinicus Rock, the tender used to bring soil down there every spring so the wives could have a little flower garden, but they didn't have to do that on Boston Light. We didn't grow much.
The history of Boston Light begins in 1716 when it was established as the first lighthouse on the North American continent. 3 years later, keeper George Worthylake, his wife and daughter, and 3 other people drowned when their canoe capsized near the island. Benjamin Franklin, 12 years old at the time, wrote a poem about the incident called The Lighthouse Tragedy and sold copies on the streets of Boston. In the late 1930s, Maurice Babcock Jr. found something very interesting in an abandoned house in outer Boston Harbor.
And we were up in the attic of this old house rummaging through old trunks and papers and books. And I happened to pick up this piece of paper, and on it indicated the Lighthouse Tragedy. And I started to read it. It began with the history, or a little story, of how this particular ballad that was written by Benjamin Franklin was found. And someone scouring the beaches, I forget the whole story now, precluding the ballad itself. I took it home to the island because through Mr. Snow and the plaques that he'd left on Boston Light, I'd heard of George Worthylake. Well, I had no idea who supposedly had written this thing. Benjamin Franklin didn't mean much to me, except he discovered electricity, so they say. So I brought it home to the island, and it was laying on my father's desk, and Mr. Snow came down to the island on one of his frequent visits, and my mother gave it to him, told him I had found it in an old house on Middle Brewster Island. So Mr. Snow asked my mother if she took it, and he took it. And a few weeks or a month or so later, when we went across to the mainland to get the morning paper, Sunday morning paper, there was big headlines in the paper. Boy finds ancient ballad, and according to the original story, it was the only known existing copy in the world, worth a king's ransom. And it got quite a lot of publicity in the local area. With arrangements made by Mr. Snow, there were 2 programs, the Big Brother radio program, which was originated in Boston, WHDH, I think. They picked it up. We the People broadcast out of New York City. They picked up the story, and my mother, father, and I, we had a free trip to New York and was on the We the People broadcast because of this story. Now, Mr. Snow had it appraised or analyzed at the Boston Public Library, as I understand it, and they couldn't prove that it was actually Benjamin Franklin's own words because they had never found an original copy. So it became a catch-22. If they ever proved that it was a copy, they'd have to have one of the original ballads that he wrote at the age of 16 and sold on the streets of Boston. And the only way they know that he wrote this ballad was that he mentions it in his autobiography, that he wrote 2 ballads, one being The Lighthouse Tragedy, and he called them wretched stuff. They weren't of much literary value. But until this day, there's never been a copy of, or a original of what he sold on the streets of Boston found. So if they ever find one, they'll prove that what I have is a copy, which will be worth nothing. The original will be worth something. So there's a catch-22. But we keep it to pass on to our kids as just to reminisce about.
We talked more about the automation of lighthouses, in particular West Quoddy Head Lighthouse, which was close to Morris Babcock's home in Lubec, Maine.
Bob Elliott from Channel 6 NBC in Portland, he happened to be down here making a film on the lighthouse automation and so forth. He was against automation, and he was against man being, he wanted that type of a story, man against machinery. And the fact that what is one life worth if this fog signal isn't working due to automation, and there's a ship runs aground on the rocks and a man is drowned, what is one life worth? Well, boy, he'd pin right in on that, you know. I imagine the Lighthouse Historical Preservation Society, or whatever it is, or that man's attitude is just like the environmentalists when it comes to some rare bird or some rare plant or some rare fish. They don't want them to become extinct. And I don't think they should become extinct. I think they should be maintained and as monuments. I believe that since next year, August 1989, is the 200th anniversary of the federal government taking over the lighthouses from the colonies, that one lighthouse somewhere along this coast should be set up as a monument to the thousands upon thousands of both civilians and Coast Guard lighthouse keepers who have kept it. There's 2 lighthouses that I can name that should be a monument. One would be Boston Light, being the oldest lighthouse on the North American continent. The second being West Quoddy Head, being the easternmost lighthouse in the United States. Well, Boston Light isn't too accessible to the general public. So I make that my second choice, even though I have a lot of sentiment for my old home. And I would like to see West Quoddy Head be set up as a monument for the 200-plus years for lighthouse keepers that lived lonely lives and devoted their life to the lighthouse system. And since West Quoddy Head is accessible, it could be manned by a Coast Guard man. It would be good public relations for the Coast Guard. It would be good for the town of Lubec as a tourist attraction, but mainly as a monument to the lighthouse keepers. I'd just like to see a statue of a lighthouse keeper. Some guy dressed in boots and a sou'wester, something like the lone sailor at the Sailors Memorial in Washington. Some kind of a statue with a memorial plaque in tribute paid to it each year on August the 7th. And a Coast Guard man manned that station. They have the Eagle. The Coast Guard has the Eagle. The Navy has the Blue Angels. The Navy has the Lone Sailor. They have all of these monuments to sailors and Marines and soldiers. We need a monument to lighthouse keepers. And we need it manned by the people who are in charge of lighthouses. In regards to the automation, with modern aids to navigation, satellite navigation, radar, it's not so important today as it used to be. But the eyes are better than any radar that was ever devised. To make sure that a light is lit, and to make sure that a fog signal is sounding in storms, I don't think you can replace it with a 86-cent transistor. We're particularly concerned about this lighthouse here. It is accessible, yet it is isolated. And the whole country seems full of vandalism. Some segment of a society just delights in destroying things. And if this light station here at West Quoddy Head there isn't somebody there to be a caretaker of it or to check on it, it's going to be vandalized, and that's the general opinion of the town. Someone's going to go out there and shoot the light out. Someone's going to hook onto the chain link fence with a pickup truck and tear it down. Well, The Coast Guard doesn't really have the say. The automation and to automate these lighthouses and to unman the lighthouses was a mandate of Congress. And I don't believe there's any man in the Coast Guard of high rank is going to come out and say, Congress, you're foolish, you shouldn't have done this. I understand that they're going to man this lighthouse with park warden or park ranger, and it's supposed to be in the next couple of weeks that a park ranger and his family or a marine fisheries man and his family are to move in there. Well, they'll have to change them every year because that's an isolated area out there. To find the man that would want to stay, the man would probably stay there, but to find a wife that would want to put up with that loneliness 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, it's going to be hard.
Following up on what Morris was saying, in the year after we did the interview, legislation was passed to maintain a keeper at Boston Light. It remained the only light station in the country that had an official keeper employed by the federal government until the end of 2023, when Sally Snowman retired after 20 years as keeper. At this time, it looks like the management of Boston Light Station will pass to the National Park Service. West Quoddy Head Light Station is part of West Quoddy State Park, and a park ranger lives in the keeper's house, upstairs from the museum and welcome center run by the West Quoddy Head Lightkeepers Association. Morris mentioned the idea of a statue of a lighthouse keeper. On National Lighthouse Day, August 7th, 2019, a statue was dedicated at Barnegat Lighthouse in New Jersey. The 8-foot-tall statue, created by sculptor Brian Hanlon, depicts a keeper in a lighthouse service uniform. To the best of my knowledge, it's the only lighthouse keeper statue in the U.S. Let's close the interview with Morris Babcock with his thoughts on the importance of lighthouses.
It is amazing that lighthouses still have a sentimental value to people, whether they come from the Midwest or whether they grew up or live on the coast and have seen one. People just love lighthouses, and I guess it's part of their genes, you know. The first settlers, the immigration to this country, one of the first things that the immigrants would see would be some landmark or some lighthouse or a Nantucket lightship. And that's the United States. That's the land of freedom. It's amazing to understand lighthouses. The idea of the lighthouse, that the ray up and down the entire coast of the United States, both east and west and the southern coast, was that the rays of the lighthouses would intertwine. And never along the coast would there be any place that you'd be out of sight of a light or a landmark of a lighthouse. And they achieved that purpose over many, many years.
One thing that Morris Babcock Jr. told me about that I don't have recorded was what happened at Boston Light during the famous hurricane of September 21st, 1938. The wind blew the door off the lighthouse, and the wind rushing up in the tower blew open the trap door at the top and blew out the light. Morris's father, Principal Keeper Morris Babcock Sr., and an assistant keeper spent the night in the lantern room, keeping the trap door shut and making sure the light didn't go out. I later had a chance to look at the logbook from that day, and all Morris Sr. wrote was that there was heavy rain and wind. He wrote absolutely nothing about what he and the assistant keeper did to make sure the light stayed on. Next, I want to play part of an interview I also did in the summer of 1988 with Larry Baum, who was the last Coast Guard keeper at Fort Point Light Station at the entrance to the Penobscot River in Maine. We talked about the automation of lighthouses, among other things. Before he went to Fort Point, Larry had been a keeper at remote Great Duck Island.
There's 8 of us left at the moment, which means in just short of a year and a half, there aren't going to be any lighthouse keepers, so it's kind of neat to be one of the last ones. And this lighthouse allowed us to live together as a family. The last place that I kept was Duck Island, and you went out for 4 weeks and came in for 2 and out for 4 and in for 2, and the family lived in town, so you saw your family once a month for 2 weeks. And that wasn't too good. But lighthouse duty is independent duty. And being independent duty means when something breaks, you got to fix it. You can't call the group quick, oh quick, my power's down, or the plumbing's stuck, or the building's falling over, the roof leaks. That's your job, is to fix it. Primary, keep the light running, keep the foghorn running, but basically you're a caretaker for buildings, which means you've got to be an electrician, a mason, a carpenter, a plumber, and a bosun's mate, and a storekeeper, and a bookkeeper, because you run all your own books. So yeah, I enjoy quite a bit. I don't do lighthouses. My specialty is I'm a lifeboat surfman. I do search and rescue. So this is vacation. I haven't done any search and rescue for 6 years now. And I'm getting ready to be transferred with the automation here to be transferred back into the search and rescue system and run the lifeboats on the West Coast. But it's been a nice change.
How long have you been here?
4.5 years. 2.5 years out on, or 2 years out on Duck Island, 4.5 years here. So 6.5 years we've been in Maine.
When I was there, Fort Point Light Station was in the process of being automated, one of the last in the country to be automated. I asked Larry where the automation process stood at that moment.
The horn, the light, the power, everything is set up. The automation is running. I turned the light off for the last time just about the last day of August. And then we turned on the automation equipment to run the test. That's what we're doing now, is running the testing equipment. But I haven't had to do any light keeper duties per se since we were automated. The reason I'm still here is we have vandalism problems. Just like all lighthouses, this one a little more because you can drive right up the driveway. So the Coast Guard is keeping a family here until the state can take the license and occupy the house. We're not going to leave the house empty under any circumstances.
Have you had any problems while you've been here with vandals?
You get the occasional gunshot, guys that are out chasing porcupines or woodchucks or whatever and think it's neat to shoot towards the light or at the light. But other than replacing some glass and having the occasional drunk come through, keeping people here has kept it, fairly quiet. Very few people use the park. We're adjacent to a state park, and not too many people use the park. Most of my visitors have come to the park and then walk towards the water and, oh, geez, there's a lighthouse, so they'll come over and visit the lighthouse. But other than the lighthouse freaks, the people that love lighthouses who come looking for us, most of our visitors and stuff are overflow from the park. I think the automation is foolish. The only reason I think it's foolish is because it's taken so long. Automation's been going on forever. Since the Coast Guard took the lighthouse service in 1937, they have automated or eliminated lights that weren't needed, or automated those that were so remote that the cost of keeping people there was ridiculous compared to the cost of actually operating the house. Some lighthouses are costing more than they're going to save. This particular lighthouse is going to end up paying itself off in about the year 2048 before it starts to save money. Matinicus Rock, Great Duck, offshore lights like that save money the first 3 years because you're not running logistics. Helicopters are ridiculous amounts of money to spend to fly food out to guys and fly guys on and off every 2 weeks. Just 1 year of helicopter runs saves the cost of an automation. So some cases it's good, some cases it's bad.
I also spoke with Larry about the visits of the Flying Santa. The tradition started in 1929 with a Maine pilot named Bill Winkapaw. For more than 40 years, the historian Edward Rowe Snow maintained the Santa flights, dropping gifts for the keepers and their families. The Hull Life-Saving Museum took over in the early 1980s, and today the nonprofit Friends of Flying Santa visit Coast Guard stations by helicopter every holiday season.
They were important to the guys who were isolated when there were stag stations, because you get tired of looking at the same 4 guys after a while, and it's nice to see somebody different. So any visit was a great event. The Flying Santa was a great event and a tradition, and it was perfect. It was the best thing for morale you could imagine on the stag stations. It was even better on the family stations, because most of the family stations were on offshore islands, and Lighthouse Service and Coast Guard does not pay that much. So being isolated and not being in the high income bracket, the kids wouldn't know it, but they wouldn't get really good visits and they wouldn't get really good presents from the present point of view. But to have the traditional Flying Santa Claus come by and stop and drop them something for them that was from Santa Claus, and to be able to see him in the airplane or see him when they stopped with the helicopters was probably the best thing for morale. It carried you through the whole year. My children in particular, I've got 3 small children, 5, 7, and 9, and from about mid-November all the way until Christmas. That's all we hear is, when's the flying Santa's coming? Is he going to come by helicopter? Who's it going to be? Is it going to look like him? When Ed McCabe took over the main section of it for the Hull Museum, we had to explain why his beard was not white. When George Morgan came up, it was easy because he had his own white beard. But the general explanation for the children was that when Ed McCabe came up was that Santa's beard didn't turn white until after Christmas. It was brown until Christmas and then white after Christmas or during Christmas. And that worked for a few times until George came up, and when George showed up with a white beard, that did it. We were shot. We had no explanation for it.
Most of the Flying Santa's present drops at lighthouses were on target, but occasionally he missed.
I talked to Russ Algren, who was the last keeper down at Cape Nettic, down at the Nubble Light. They got Russ's windshield one year, the first year he was there. And it was real nice. They reimbursed him for his windshield, and he got to keep the package. You know, I thought that was very fair. They figured the package had been destroyed, so they drove up and brought a package to replace the one that went through the windshield. And then, you know, I think he came close to offering to buy a new car, but Russ said, no, just, you know, the insurance will take care of the windshield, and don't worry about it. But he did buy a new windshield for the car.
Larry told me an interesting story about one of the early keepers at Fort Point Light.
The only thing, I've dug a little bit of history, and the only thing I've found about this particular lighthouse here at Fort Point is that the second lighthouse keeper was John Odom. John Odom, at some point, the first year he was here, was kidnapped along with his oldest son and placed on a rock upriver so that, as Ed Snow put it, the pirates could land without being seen. They came in by longboat, grabbed him, left, and then brought the vessel in. The whereabouts of the treasure is not known. It's still one of those, quote, lost treasures. It was supposedly put around Bullseye Rock, close to Sandy Point. Sandy Point in those days was not called Sandy Point, something else was, and Bullseye Rock is an unknown place in this area. So it is pretty much, it's gone, it's a lost. But the only story is that they came aboard, grabbed Odom and his son, stuck them up on the rock, and then went and did whatever they had to do. Odom's wife came back home from somewhere and realized he was gone, and about a day later they found Odom and his son up on the rock. The rock is now called Odom's Ledge, and it's about 6 miles from here.
I also spoke with Larry about his ideas of lighthouses as aids to navigation moving into the future. This interview was 36 years ago, and his predictions about lighthouses losing their significance as aids to navigation haven't quite come true, but we continue to head in that direction.
The lighthouse has been replaced by Loran and radar and electronics. The lighthouse as an aid to navigation does not exist. I mean, even the littlest pleasure boater can afford the Loran, and all the commercial vessels have all got radar and Loran, and the NOAA's charting system is so good now that you don't have to depend on being able to go from lighthouse to lighthouse to lighthouse. But the uses of lighthouses as aids to navigation, it just doesn't exist.
So you think the lights will
It's
be off?
been, I think the lights will be off. I think that the Coast Guard will have licensed all of them that they can license to private people or towns or historical societies or state parks or whatever, and they will become history and less working monuments or working aids. There'll be more, they're going to go the way of the old railroad station and of the old lamp post and that type of stuff. We're right on the edge of the tail end of it now. We're still running a few, but I'd say at the rate of technology, 20 years on the outside, and there's no need to use a lighthouse. But we're just at the beginning of the historical value. They, in the past 10 years, have just decided that they should all be landmarks. They should be kept up. The biggest part of the licensing procedure, in big bold letters on the license, says that you must keep it in a like-new historical condition. This particular lighthouse has a bell tower. I've got one of the very few, I think there are 6 bell towers left in the whole country. I have the only one that's owned by the government. They've just now, in the past few years, recognized that they have a historical value. So far as history is concerned, lighthouses are just coming into their own. So far as being aids to navigation are concerned, they're very fast on the way out.
On that same trip up the Maine coast in the late summer of 1988, I also interviewed Malcolm Rouse at Owl's Head Light Station in the Mid-Coast region. Owl's Head Light was also in the process of being automated, so Mac Rouse was the last Coast Guard keeper of that station. Just a few months earlier, he had left West Quoddy Headlight in Lubec, Maine, when it was automated.
On the 29th of June, we said our goodbyes as a family. We had the house, the movers had already moved us out, see, on the 28th and 29th. And we were cleaning the house and everything, getting it, and I said, look, let's take a break. My wife and I went up to the tower, and one last look, because we knew the 30th was having the decommissioning, and it was going to be hectic. We had counted on like 50 people showing up maybe for this decommissioning ceremony. We had maybe 250, and everything was rush. And the last day there, on the 30th, it was just one big blur. After the decommissioning, you had to talk to all the news people and that, which I didn't mind, but it was one after the other, the same old questions, and about after the 16th time, you got tired of it. Then, when we was leaving, one last look as we was going up the hill. And that was it. It was very sad, but in a way, it was kind of like a good feeling, too, because I would have felt a lot differently if the state hadn't took over the house. Because if the house had to stay there vacant, I would swear if they didn't keep anybody up there, it would have been burned in 30 days. It would have been burned right flat to the ground. And that's what a lot of citizens were concerned about, it burning down. But so far it's worked out real well, but we was kind of worrying about that and going up, and we've had a lot of good memories up there, and looking down, you know, from the top of the driveway when we left, it was, well, we was kind of glad if we gotta go, let's do it. Let's not stop, worry about it, away we went. But, oh, I don't think a day or two goes by that we say, geez, I wish we was down in West Quoddy. Wish we was back. Everything was a lot different. I guess maybe I'm not used to the civilized world. I'd rather be back down there where it was all carefree. You know, West Quoddy was it. That's the highlight of I've got over 19 years in this outfit, and that's the highlight of my tour right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where are you from?
Maine.
What part?
Oh, Aroostook County, way up north. My wife and I originally we're from Rockport. She's from Rockport. And
so she's near home?
Oh yeah. But we have a house and everything right here in Rockport, so yeah, I've been all over. The old Coast Guard cutter Snohomish, and I was on her when we decommissioned her. Then I went down to West Quoddy and closed that place down. Now I'm here closing this one down, and I'm going to close myself down. Yeah, that's the way it goes.
I asked Mac Rouse about the duties of a lighthouse keeper.
Well, you keep the lens and the brass clean. That's a weekly job. Okay, you don't go up every day and do the brass. You go up every morning. Of course, you have to shut the light off and turn it back on at sunset. Okay, you shut it off in the morning after sunrise and shut her down and turn it back on at about half hour before sunset. Well, the automation is going to be shining all the time, 24 hours a day. You go up, you do your daily checks. You also have buoys around here, aids navigations that Lightkeeper is responsible for to check out every day. I have 6 of them here. So you have to check those out. Then you come down, and of course you're always up there. You're scanning the whole area, see, well, you know, you might see something out there floating. You're always looking, you know. You never know if it's going to be a boat turnover, you know, overturned boat or whatever. A lot of people don't realize light stations send the weather. We send the weather every 3 hours during the day. Now, a lot of them offshore lights would send it 24 hours a day, and that's one thing the Weather Bureau is missing. Up to date, right on top of the weather, you know, all the time. Bingo. They love the Coast Guard lights sending the weather like that because they didn't have a machine trying to figure out what was out there. They had human eyes. Then you know, you get your cleanup, your daily cleanups around the light and the house and that. Plus, a lot of people don't realize you're responsible for all the maintenance at a lighthouse, all the painting, everything. Now, if it's something happened mechanical wise, of course, you get a hold of the right people and they come down and work on them. But if it was on a weekend, it was left up to the light keeper. He might be talking to someone on the phone. They try to jury rig it over the phone, say, you know. But light keeper's got quite a lot of responsibility.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to these recordings I made nearly 4 decades ago. I'm glad I had the chance to listen to them again and to share them. In the next 2 episodes, we will be listening to a 2-part interview with Henry Gonzalez, president of the U.S. Lighthouse Society. Until then, to all our regular listeners and our new ones, thanks so much for listening, and keep a good light.
Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.